Hello and welcome back to Chillers and Thrillers Season 3. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I am your host, Em, and in this podcast, I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, gore, or skepticism, only 100% true spooky tales. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. It's great to have you here. This is not only Season 3, but also the podcast's 1-year anniversary. I wanted to thank you all for listening, sharing the podcast, and leaving your ratings and reviews. Thanks to all of you, this has been an incredibly fulfilling year. I hope everyone is having or had a great summer break. And in honor of summer activities, I wanted to have a summer-themed episode to kick off Season 3. One of my favorite childhood memories is going to our local amusement parks and fairs. There's no known hauntings at the locations I went to, but I did find some incredibly spooky tales of true-life hauntings in amusement parks across the world. Most notably, it seems like Disney World is a hotspot for paranormal activity, especially the Haunted Mansion ride. From my research, no one knows the exact cause of these hauntings, but there seems to be a very common theory that a parent may have scattered the ashes of their child in the Haunted Mansion ride. And now, across the years, people and workers alike all report seeing a little boy that seems to randomly appear and disappear. Now, let's not waste any more time. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and listen in. Six Flags, submitted by XT Bro. When I was about 13, I went down to San Antonio with my family and a buddy of mine. We were staying at a hotel that was right next to Six Flags Fiesta, Texas. Since we were staying at the hotel, they gave us free tickets and early access to the park, which was awesome. So me and my buddy go in, and we're basically the only people there, maybe a few other hotel guests. Now, my buddy was terrified of roller coasters, so I basically rode all the rides by myself that day. We were about to leave, and I decided I wanted to ride the Rattler, which is an older wooden roller coaster. I get up to the coaster, and there's no line, so I go straight up to the front cart. I thought I was going to be the only one, but a young Hispanic teenager walks up and asks if he can sit with me at the last second. I say, sure, no problem. We both strap in, but the cart attendant only checked my seat to see if it was secure. I just thought if he checked one side, it meant that both sides were safe. So the ride starts, all is good, coaster was really fun. When the ride stops, me and the teenager get off the ride and I tell him, take it easy, and he does the same. I walk out of the ride towards the little area where it shows you the pictures it took when it goes down the big fall. I look up to the screen to wait for my picture. Like I said before, it was just me on the ride before the other teenager got on at the last second. When the picture finally showed up, I just about peed my pants. It was just me in the picture. No one was sitting next to me. It was an empty chair. There wasn't a glare. There wasn't anything that would have obscured the teen sitting next to me. I looked all over for the kid around the ride and throughout the park for the rest of the day and never saw him again. I even went back up to the top of the ride to ask the cart attendant, but they had switched shifts by that time and it was not the same person. It's one of the craziest things that has ever happened to me, and I will always believe in ghosts because of this. Haunted Mansion photo, submitted by user Main Street USA. I took my 100-foot night shot accessory to Walt Disney World with the specific purpose of taking ride photos of the Haunted Mansion for a Walt Disney World virtual visit. Well, after documenting the ride, I put the camera away for the rest of the day and went back to our place that evening and began to download the photos to my laptop. After doing so, I scrolled through them to make sure I had all I needed. And lo and behold, on one of the first shots of the attraction, I saw something that definitely was not there when I was on the ride itself. This photo was taken in the first hallway of the attraction, with the eye following portraits. It appears as though a child is peeking his head out of the doom buggy and looking directly at me. Not only was this child not there when I took the picture, but there wasn't a child of this age within 20 people in front of me in line. Not only that, what was the child doing looking at me? There is no flash and no visible light coming from my direction. It was all infrared and invisible to the naked eye. Having said that, I think it's an incredibly spooky photo. I have no idea where that kid came from. For podcast listeners, a zoomed in and brightened version of this photo will be posted on the YouTube and Instagram channels. It's very creepy, and I suggest you check it out. The Crying Baby, submitted by Anonymous. I worked at a local amusement park that apparently used to be a graveyard. At night, when we left, part of my job was to check the rides and make sure that there was no one hiding or anything forgotten left behind. There was one ride which was indoor with animatronics, where people would sit and it would take you through the dark cave-themed animatronic dialogue. And I went in to check up on it. It was pitch black, we had a light, but it was dull and not that bright. So as I get halfway to the point where the animatronics are, I start hearing a baby cry. I immediately bolted the other way and ran as fast as I could, and as I got to the entrance, which was where I was going towards, the lights on the ride turned on, and the animatronics powered on. Mind you, there was no one there besides me. I dashed to the park exit and never worked there again. The place shut down in 2014. The Tables, submitted by user rootkKRP. I worked at Six Flags Magic Mountain. While stocking up on one of the carts from within an unused empty location, I had an unexplainable experience. The location I was in used to be a restaurant that served pizza. It was called Laughing Dragon near the Superman ride if you're familiar with the park. It's empty and void of life and only gets used on occasion for maybe some training. The tables we used for the restaurants were stacked upside down on one side. These tables were incredibly heavy, concrete topped, and would take 2 guys to move them. Upon entering the location and beginning my inventory, I felt uneasy and chalked it up to being tired and creeped out because it was late. To get to the stockroom, you have to pass by the dining area with the tables, and I did so without incident. After counting our overpriced ice creams, I turn around to head out the way I came in and lock up. What met me as I turned around the dark corner freaked me out. Blocking my exit were 3 tables sitting right side up and lined up, obstructing my path. I called out if anyone was there and was met with silence. I simply turned around and ran to the back entrance and left the building from there. Afterwards, I explained to a coworker how I was alone up there and heard absolutely no one. I was later told that years before, a little boy with a heart condition had unfortunately passed away right in front of the restaurant, probably 10 feet from where the incident occurred, and it was rumored that he still haunted the location. I hate closing at night now. Amusement Park Ghosts, submitted by user MistyNery. Although I've had several paranormal experiences in my life, I was always a skeptic. I try to debunk my own experiences. What if I was just tired? There must be a logical explanation. However, this experience made me a believer. A few years ago, I visited my friend who lives abroad. We decided to go inside an old amusement park that had been abandoned years ago. As a kid, my friend visited the place every week, so it was pure nostalgia for her. We snuck through a hole in the fence and entered the park. The place was taken back by nature, mostly overgrown and with small, swampy puddles everywhere. We were nervous about snakes hiding in the grass and about the big pack of feral dogs roaming the property, but the paranormal hadn't crossed our minds. Upon entering the park, the dogs barked at us, warning us to leave them alone, so we avoided the area where they were and went exploring. We seemed to be the only people there. After a good 30 minutes of exploring, we stumbled upon an empty karaoke bar. The place feels off somehow, not like the other buildings we encountered. My friend explains that this building is not what it seems. Karaoke bars in her country are often a cover for alcohol consumption, which was illegal back then. She doesn't recognize the place though, which is weird since she spent a big part of her childhood at the park. We figured that it must have been a bit hidden away from the crowd since it was likely linked to some illegal activity. The moment we entered the building, my attention was immediately drawn towards a creepy door with a broken glass panel. You could see that there was nothing on the other side, but somehow, the darkness behind the door seemed more solid. I stared at it for at least a good 15 seconds before I told myself to stop freaking out about a door. While we explored the first floor, I started hearing footsteps right behind me. Thinking it was my friend, I turned around, ready to make a stupid joke about her creeping up on me. But she isn't there. I see her at the other end of the room, at least 8 meters away from me. I chalk it up to being weird acoustics and don't tell her about it. Do you know that feeling you get when people are staring at you? That's how the second floor felt. It was as if we walked into a crowded room, except there was nobody there. Like on the first floor, the darkness of some unlit areas somehow seemed too dark, more solid. I became increasingly nervous, but don't tell my friend, since I don't want to sound crazy. Soon, my friend stopped in her tracks and said that she wasn't comfortable exploring any further. She later described that room as a black hole. She recalls feeling as if all her movements were much slower than normal, and her brain was foggy. This was right above the door that freaked me out so much. Back on the first floor, we feel silly for being nervous and try to overcome our fears. The door was stuck, and I had to put my weight behind it to get it open. We saw a glimpse of a small storage room, and then the door slammed shut again. We almost made a run for it, but since we stubbornly didn't want to give in to our fears and be cowards, we took a few more pictures of the room before we left. Once outside, we rationalized it by saying it must have been some sort of animal, a stray dog maybe. But we're not convinced. Opening the door took some strength, so what animal could have closed it with such force? There was barely any space between the open door and the wall, so I doubt that it could have been a person hiding there. We talked for a bit to lighten the mood, and we feel braver now that we're outside again. We decide to visit her favorite attraction next, the pirate ship. In the past, it would swing back and forth, but now we couldn't get it to move no matter how much we tried. We pushed against it with our body's full weight, but the ship wouldn't budge. We take a few photos while we chat about my friend's memories of the park. All of a sudden, the pirate ship begins to move. Slow at first. So slow that I thought I was imagining it. But then, it starts to swing more clearly. Since we don't feel the creepy vibes that we felt at the karaoke bar, we decided to stay and watch. After a few minutes, my friend remarks that we should head back soon since we don't want to be in this place after dark. Immediately after these words left her mouth, it gets darker. as if it was suddenly twilight. Remember the dogs who barked when we entered the park? They had been quiet since they realized we were not a threat. But now, they go wild, barking, howling in the distance. My friend and I don't hesitate and make a run for it. We run through the dark, overgrown park while the dogs go crazy. It was surreal. Once we reach the hole in the fence, we crawl out as fast as we can. And suddenly we feel safe again. I swear to God, once outside that hole, the sun was shining bright again. We looked up to see if it was just a well-timed cloud that moved in front of the sun, but we couldn't see anything. To this day, my friend is convinced that something told us to leave, since it got dark right after we decided to go home. I don't believe in these kinds of theories, but feeling-wise, it genuinely felt as if we went through some sort of gate when we entered the park. As if it was its own little world. The contrast was just that big. Back home, we talked about our experiences. Apparently, we both felt uneasy in the karaoke bar, long before we actually voiced these feelings. I told her about the creepy vibe I got from the door and showed her a picture that I took of it when we entered the building. She told me she felt the same thing and took a picture just before we left. Upon comparisons, we realized that the door is cracked open a little bit in my photo, but in hers, it's half open. These photos were taken 5 minutes apart, and it seems very unlikely that someone snuck in to open it while we were on the second floor. The dog pack was in a different area of the park, and there was no wind that day. I don't have an explanation, but given our other experiences at the park, this creeped me out even more. Like I said, I have experienced strange things before, but nothing like this. In the hour that we spent at the park, I went from skeptic to believer. I would love to go back someday and see what happens. Strange Occurrences, submitted by user Skoodleoo. Back when I was younger, I worked a few years in a theme park in England, Chessington World of Adventures. I was working as area rides team leader, so I was one of a few who were in charge of the rides in a particular area on a day-to-day basis. One of the rides was Tomb Blasters, as it's currently known. At the end of the day, once the park closed, there were certain processes in place. For Tomb Blaster, the ride operator had to walk around the entire ride to make sure the ride was clear of guests. Only then could we hand over the ride from operations to engineering. This night, Tomb Blaster had had a large queue line as it had been raining, so everyone wanted to go indoors. So I had finished helping clean another ride nearby and went to help the Tomb Blaster staff. After the last ride vehicle had left, I went and lowered the external door and the front door. The platform staff had left to go help other rides, so it was just myself and the ride operator. At this point, it was just the two of us, so we commenced our walk around the ride. Halfway, we started getting creepy vibes, as if someone was watching us. We then decided to go and have a look in a storage area where the old terror tomb props were stored. This area was actually in the ride area. While in there, we started hearing distant talking. We thought it was strange, as there shouldn't be anyone in the ride area at all. There physically couldn't be anyone in the area apart from the two of us. We then started hearing footsteps walking along the emergency walkway adjacent to the ride. We then both decided to go and look who it was. We both went different ways. The ride operator went back the way we had come, and I continued through the rest of the ride to the exit. The ride operator got back to the station first, and I arrived a short while later. He confirmed that no one had come through, and I never saw anyone. It was clearly voices and footsteps. Most people would put it up to overactive imaginations, but we both felt and heard the same thing. There was a rumor around the park that while the ride was originally being built, a worker had died. But it wasn't until I was working the closed season at the end of the year that I was able to have a deeper walk around the ride and found the plaque about his death. Both the entrance and exit were blocked and checked, so we both know we were the only ones that could have been there at that time. After we freaked each other out by saying it was Herman the German, we left via the exit and handed it over to engineering. There was no report next day telling us we had left anyone in the ride that shouldn't have been there. The Ghost of Great Wolf Lodge. Submitted by user nmate_321. Have you ever heard of Great Wolf Lodge? The huge indoor water park packed with arcades, restaurants, and basically everything you could imagine? Well, I've been there twice, and the first time I had an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. I was there with my brother, my aunt and uncle, and my cousin. We got a room that came with the kid cabin. All that was in the kid cabin was a bunk bed, a small TV, a nightstand, and some cool paintings on the wall. The first night was fine. I slept on the top bunk, and my cousin Natalia slept on the bottom. The next day, my cousin begged to sleep on the bottom bunk again, so me, wanting the top bunk anyway, allowed it. I stayed up really late that night. All I had for a light was a small 3DS. As I started to fall asleep, I put down the DS, and I heard my cousin giggling. "What's so funny?" I asked, laughing a little myself. "Stop, you're scaring me," she replied, her laughter fading a bit. "What?" I responded, confused and a bit scared. "How are you making that face?" At this point, her voice didn't have any more laughter to it. I was rushing to turn on my 3DS and asked, "What do you mean? I'm up here." And she paused. "Who is that?" she said, realizing whoever she was seeing, it wasn't me. She started to cry and call for me. The DS was still loading, and by the time it turned on, she said it was gone. The next day, I asked more about it, and she said that there was a girl with black hair bobbing up and down and smiling really big. To this day, I'm still scared and very afraid to go back. Walt's Ghost. Submitted by OneDestiny Princess. I work at Emporium on Main Street in Walt Disney World. Now, shops on Main Streets close an hour after the park does, and we leave an hour and a half after that. It was a weekend, so I was leaving around 2:30 in the morning. I went behind the Emporium to grab my lunchbox there, so I wasn't leaving with the rest of my fellow cast members. I was walking across Main Street when I heard someone humming and walking behind me, clearly wearing dress shoes. Most guys don't wear dress shoes with their Emporium costumes, so I turned around to see who it was, and there was no one there. It wasn't a malicious presence. In fact, it felt very welcoming. I like to think that it was Walt. Speaking of Walt, my friend was opening Carnation Cafe on Main Street one morning. She smelled cigar smoke very distinctly and couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Then the smell hit her very strongly, and she felt someone touch her shoulder, like a good job sort of feeling. We were pretty sure that that was Walt too. As a last story, a friend of mine and I decided we wanted to be the last ones on the Haunted Mansion. The girl working let us close the gates to the mansion, and we were the last ones on the Doom Buggy. However, in the seance circle, when you see the Doom Buggies all around the room, to our left were those who boarded before us, and to our right was a young boy sitting in one of the buggies. We didn't see him after the ride, and we never saw him again, but it scared us half to death. Nighttime at Disney. Submitted by user RegionsBeyond. I used to work in outdoor vending. Most carts are brought back to a main warehouse each night for cleaning, and the popcorn carts are much harder to move, so they stay in the park each night. Since they are brought back to be cleaned, the vendor who closes the cart has to clean it on stage. Naturally, sometimes vendors just want to go home after a long day and don't do a very good job. At the end of the day, someone goes to close the park, which in vending speak means to inspect the carts and make sure they were cleaned properly. This was one of my favorite jobs because I got to walk around a nearly empty Disneyland. About 45 minutes to an hour after the park closed, I would head out to close the park. I would usually start in Toontown. Guests are still in the park, so I wanted to start where the crowds were gone. Then the cart by It's a Small World, the Matterhorn, Tomorrowland, then back through Fantasyland to Frontierland. Then, after Frontierland and New Orleans Square, I would head to Main Street where I usually met the vendors as they were finishing up their cleaning. That was a roundabout way to tell you why I was walking along Big Thunder Trail from Fantasyland to Frontierland one night around 2 a.m. when it was very dark and nobody was around. Where most of Disneyland has area music in the background, this area has sounds playing of crickets, birds, frogs, coyotes, and other wilderness sounds. I had heard it so much that I knew when to expect each sound, if I was paying attention to it. So when I heard my name, whispered in the dark, it stood out. I'd never heard anything in those sounds that sounded like Andrew. I turned towards the sound of the whisper and didn't see anybody. I shrugged it off as my imagination and kept going. After a few seconds, it came again. Andrew. Slightly louder than a whisper this time. Andrew. It sounded like someone was speaking to me from about 5 feet away, behind me and a little to the right. I turned, and once again, there wasn't anyone there. I knew I had heard something this time, so I wasn't as quick to dismiss it and move along. Thinking a coworker was messing around, I got out my flashlight and started searching. I wasn't quite to the bridge across from the abandoned mine trail tunnel, and the only possible hiding place was in the foliage to my right. I searched around and didn't see anyone, nor did I hear anyone moving through the plants, which are numerous there. The nearest fake rock with a hinge where someone could open it to hide with a water pump was still well ahead of me. After a few minutes, I gave up and decided that, once again, I was hearing things. I turned off my flashlight and started back towards the hill down to the Mark Twain dock. I hadn't taken 2 steps when right at my ear, there was the sound of my name being shouted. Andrew. A quick glance showed nobody there. I ran like the pirate being chased by the large lady in the Pirates of the Caribbean, except not in circles. I made a beeline for the popcorn cart that was at the Golden Horseshoe side of the Mark Twain dock, where things were well lit and other cast members were around. I still wasn't sure what had just happened. So I finished my rounds of the popcorn wagons, looking over my shoulder once in a while, but I didn't see or hear anything odd after getting off Big Thunder Trail. I went back to our warehouse behind the Disneyland New Orleans Square station. One of my good friends was working that night, and I pulled him aside to tell him the story. He went kind of pale and said, "You too?" Apparently, I'm not the only one who's been called on that trail. I spoke to 3 others who heard their names that night there too, so I'm not sure how well known the story is. For the skeptics, yes, I realize that it's possible it was a prank. If so, however, my normally loud and rowdy coworkers suddenly become ninjas to pull it off unseen and unheard as they move. Plus, at 2 in the morning, the closers usually kind of want to finish up and go home, and everything got done on time that night. So yes, I am a believer in the hauntings of Disneyland, and at Walt Disney World as well. I tend to look at things with a skeptical eye and not believe every story I hear, but it's easier to believe when you've experienced something out of the ordinary yourself. The Haunted Theater of Boblo Island, submitted by user old_dude. When I was a kid, I worked at Boblo Island as a summer job. I was there the night of a tornado. It was the night that we saw the ghost of Smiley the magician. I know the name sounds silly, but it is actually the name of the guy. Boblo Island was an amusement park that was at one point larger than Cedar Point. In my days, they were very comparable, although I think Cedar Point was a little larger. It was on a small island in the Detroit River at the mouth of Lake Erie. It was a Canadian island and had passenger boats that sailed from Detroit, Gibraltar, and Amherstburg, Ontario. I had worked several places on the island throughout the summer. Many of my shifts were half days, so the rest of the day I would spend hanging out in the amusement park. One of the places I would go was the old theater. The magicians at the time were always changing, and there were lots of pretty showgirls. It seemed that people never worked in the theater very long. One of the magicians, who seemed to have some fame behind him and worked at Boblo for many years in his younger days, he would tell all the stagehands secrets about the building. Stuff like special modifications for the stage that were built for certain tricks that were no longer allowed to be performed, and famous people who had secretly worked or visited the stage. This old guy told so many stories, and he was very good at telling them. The staff ate up the stories, especially the one about Smiley. Smiley Smilovich, magician extraordinaire, performed in the Boblo Theater magic show in the late 1930s, early 1940s. His claim to fame was that he had attended Harry Houdini's private classes and operated his backstage performances in the late 1920s. He was close enough that he visited Houdini several times in the Detroit hospital just before he died, where Houdini had told him secrets of his magic tricks and discussed with him ideas he had for future tricks. This gave Smiley an edge over all other entertainers, and he led a long and semi-famous career. He eventually settled in to perform at Boblo, since back in the day it was a high-paying gig. Smiley, at the end of his career, was an older Jewish man who was very large and imposing. He had a longer, square beard and often wore a bolo hat. He was not in good health, but being a vaudeville actor was able to dazzle the crowds. It is said that he drew the largest crowds ever to that little old theater. And he died on stage during a trick. It was known as the metamorphosis trick, a trick where he would place a trunk on the stage and then climb in, lock it, and light it on fire. The fire would burn through the outer shell of the truck, exposing the missing magician inside. He had performed this trick many times, but this time his large stomach had put pressure on his heart as he squeezed into position in the trunk. As the trunk was being locked, he had a heart attack and died. They closed the theater down for several years until the company manager decided to change the show. The new manager reopened the theater, and it is said that the ghost of Smiley would return from time to time, and that stagehands and magicians would see him backstage or at the back of the crowd, especially if the magician at the time was performing a magic trunk trick. Of course, I did not believe much about that story, as there were many, many stories of people who died from being thrown off rides to people who died performing high diving acts or other risky performances. Some time had gone by and I forgot all about it, until one day I was in the main office in the cafeteria. On the tables were several old black and white photos of the island throughout the years. There was some sort of collection or something that someone had been working on, sorting tons of old pictures. I don't know why, nor did I ever meet the person, as I only had 20 minutes to eat and get back to the job. So I thumbed through some of the pictures. There were pictures of the old water ski show with names signed on the pictures. There was the old captain who had given a personal message on his picture, and all the pictures showed the island throughout the years. Then I found a picture of the old theater. It was very new in that picture and had a very large man dressed in a black formal wear with a large beard and a bolo hat. He was standing in front of the main doors as a flood of people were entering. He was standing with his arms up and outstretched. He seemed proud and happy. At the bottom of the picture, in faded pencil, was written the name, Smiley. It was him. The story could be true. The image of this picture is still burnt in my mind today. It was a very amazing discovery and stayed in my thoughts for a long time. But eventually it passed and I didn't think about it any longer, until the night of the tornado. It had been a long time since I had thought about the old theater story, as the old magician that told the stories were no longer there. It was in late summer. I was now working as a security guard. We were warned that there were bad storms moving in, and in no time the sky turned that gray-yellow, and the winds were strong off and on. It was then that we were told that there was a tornado warning in effect, and that the larger rides were being shut down until it cleared. In no time, the sky turned black. The air turned cool and cracks of lightning in the distance could be seen. At the time, most of the people had packed into the last 3 or so boats off the island. There were 5 boats in total, 2 large steamboats that docked in Detroit, and they left and would not return. There was a cruiser yacht that docked in Gibraltar. It too sailed and would not return. This left the last boat that docked in Amhertsburg. It was a bi-level tugboat shaped passenger boat. The weather was getting really bad, and word got around that we were going to evacuate the island. All the other boats were no longer returning, and only the little tugboat that was going to bring the rest of the people to a shelter in Amhertsburg. Soon the announcements went out, and the park got really quiet. The wind was terrible, and we, security, passed from building to building to avoid the harsh winds. We were told to do a quick search of the island and then get to the loading docks to evacuate on the last boat. The loading docks was a small dock, and that is the only landing used today. It was on the far end of the island and sheltered more from the winds. We were told to be no longer than 30 minutes because the captain said he would not make it back to Amherstburg's dock. As we scattered out into our designated areas, I remember all the stuffed animals blowing down the main path in one large tumbling ball. They were blown out into the river. All the garbage cans were dumped and sending garbage, dust, and litter zipping through the air. We moved through the area and did a quick look. My area was very near the old theater. I stopped and met up with another group. At this time, it was getting really bad. The old-fashioned cars were blowing back, rolling down the streets. We had about 10 minutes left, and we were on the far side of the island. We would have to move quickly. Just as we were getting ready to leave, someone asked if the old theater was checked. It wasn't. So me and one of the others agreed to go check it quickly, as we were bigger guys and the winds weren't throwing us off as much as the others. We moved quickly towards the old theaters, and the others took off for the loading docks. Just as we were about to make it to the theater, the power on the island failed. Emergency lights kicked in. They were red and some floodlights that were sparsely scattered throughout the island and in buildings. With the lights out, I could now see the sky. It was black, and the wind moved through so strong that I could actually see it. It was foggy streams of air blasting overhead. We saw the teacup Ferris wheel pods flying over our heads. I counted 3 of them as we made it into the theater. The theater was just as dark, and for the first time, it felt spooky. We quickly searched the main and backstage. We spoke to each other as we moved around, calling out for anyone. We discussed the tornado and if it was best to stay in the theater instead of facing the wind for the total length of the island. We knew we had about 6 to 8 minutes left. As we got ready to dash out, satisfied that the theater was empty, we both stopped as the theater suddenly felt occupied. We both looked back at the stage and could see in the dark shadows between the partially open curtains a large bearded man in a bolo hat looking out at us. He seemed confused and concerned. He looked at both of us, me first, and then the other guy. I shot a glance at the other security guard. He was as white as I was. The magician moved to come out of the shadows, and we bolted out of the theaters. The winds were howling on and off and sounded like a tea kettle. We darted in full run back to the food court through the back passages behind the games and rides to the main path. We watched a log flume cart roll past us and could see the vending tents were stripped of their canvases. Other rides were crashing into each other and tumbling around. We had made a mad dash for the docks and found the boat. The water from the river was spraying everywhere. I almost hesitated as the thought of climbing on the boat that was heaving around so violently and the constant water spray slamming into my face seemed worse than staying on the island. We were quickly helped onto the boat and huddled in the bottom enclosed area. We were counted, given life jackets, and told to sit with our heads between our knees. At this point, the other security guard and I were separated. We waited for one last crazy guy to get on, and we made it in the 1-minute mark. The boat set off, and we fought the massive waves like swells in the river. The boat rose and rocked and slammed into the water over and over again. Water sprayed in through the badly sealed windows and back door. The hull of the boat thundered off, the waves cracking, snapping, and banging noises frightening me into a pseudo-reality, where I was very aware I was about to drown at any moment as the boat could suddenly go under the waves. We rushed down the docks as pieces of the steel roofing tore off. We rushed until we reached the underground passage across the road that would lead up steps of the far side of the parking lot. It wasn't until I was well under the cement underpass that I stopped to turn to see the island. It was almost impossible to see, but in the moments when the lightning cracked, I could see the black swirling mass of clouds consuming the island. Boblo stayed closed for the rest of the season. It opened late in the spring of the following year, but it did not do well. It closed for the last time at the end of that year. That night was the last time I was on the island. It marked the end of an era for me. I did tell a few guys at work, and one even visited the island. He said he was able to get into the theater through one of the boarded up doors, that it was freaky inside, and he felt as if he was being watched the whole time. I told him the story that I have written here, and he seemed concerned for a few moments during the story, and then we laughed off the legend of Smiley Smilovich as we parted. But I knew the ghost was real, and I think my coworker did too. I honestly don't know how much of Smiley's story is true, nor do I know what came first, the story or the ghost. But I do know that there was a picture out there of Smiley, and there is a ghost. And if you visit, I am sure you could still find him. And that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories, and as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. You can drop me a line at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com, or feel free to leave any comments on the YouTube channel. I hope you'll join me for next time. I have some great episodes planned for this season. Please remember to share with your paranormally inclined friends and family. And in the meantime, I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe.